And today I will deal with 3 lectures from church history that proves from history that this doctrine that was the most popularized by basically Lutheranism and Calvinism. It goes to the very roots, it goes to the very foundation of Protestantism. That's why Protestants historically have been the hardest people to get healed. Catholics have been the easiest. Wimber taught me that. He said, when you start praying for the sick, you'll find that Protestants are much harder to get healed than Catholics are. And the reason for that is Protestants have been taught that healing is not for today from their churches and from their seminaries, and in ways that Catholics never were taught that. Secondly, as we go through this, we're going to find out why that happened, how did these roots take place, and the other thing is in the 3 other lectures I'll give tomorrow on B.B. Warfield, we will not look at cessationism from a historical basis of why historically it's inaccurate, but we will look at it from philosophical and hermeneutical principles of how you interpret Scripture and how Warfield violated his own very good hermeneutical principles. I have no problem. I think Warfield's hermeneutical principles are actually excellent. He violated them. And we'll be looking at the philosophical presuppositions that he believed to be true that caused him to have such a rejection. Now, Princeton Seminary is just right around the corner from here. And Princeton Seminary was the last bastion of against liberalism in the 1800s and early 1900s. This is the only exception to water. This is my vitamin C water in the sanctuary here. But anyway, as we're looking at one of the things that Warfield did, and I call it Warfield and his echoes. And we chose Warfield because his writing was the best exposition, the best representation of the cessationist position held in America. And everybody after Warfield and his counterfeit miracles is basically an echo of Warfield. And for example, John MacArthur is an echo of Warfield. And so if you deal with Warfield, you deal with all the echoes. And one of the practices that Warfield did, and again, if you don't know, B.B. Warfield was this famous Princeton theologian, and but tomorrow we'll look at some of the reasons why they rejected miracle, how they defined miracle, and from that period on. As a matter of fact, when I was in college, my professor at seminary said B.B. Warfield drove the nail in the last nail in the coffin of supernaturalism, and no one believes it's tenable today to believe in the supernatural as far as the thing of the religion. That was one of my liberal professors. Having said that, there's two groups of people in the United States that don't expect God to move in the service. Number one is in a sense of a healing or a miracle. Number one basically is your cessationist, and the second group are the liberals. Now, they're strange bedfellows, and I'll talk about that probably tomorrow, because they both end up in the same place, but for diametrically opposite reasons. Though not as opposite as what you might think. Let me explain that a little bit, and then I'm going to go ahead and get started. Warfield, who was radically opposed to the higher critical methods of with its anti-supernaturalism when it was applied to the text. When he studied the accounts in history of the miraculous, he then stepped away from that the way he treated Scripture, and he took the historical method with its anti-supernatural presuppositions that the liberal theologians applied to the New Testament era, that he rejected and would not do that himself. But then when it came to studying any account of a miracle after the death of the apostles, he then bought hook, line, and sinker into that same way of studying if something could be real or not that the liberals had used for the Bible. He used that same method for anything after the Bible was written. So there was a very inconsistent view. And the bottom line basically is this for the liberals. You say, well, why would they not believe? Because they're so committed to an Enlightenment worldview that was a scientific understanding. It was more Newtonian physics instead of quantum physics, which was much more cause-effect, and the laws of nature seemed to have been in concrete, and the understanding that God would ever, or the understanding that there was a God that would break that. If there was a God, he wouldn't break those laws of nature. Well, if you start out with that, then you automatically have to, and if you believe this is the way modern man thinks, then you try to explain away anything supernatural because you feel that most people who are highly educated don't believe in the supernatural. The only problem with that is history has proven them wrong. Harvey Cox, a doctoral professor of theology at Harvard, wrote a book in the 60s, The Secular City, which premise was the church wouldn't be able to hold the cities because we were becoming more secular because of our anti-supernaturalism. We're getting to coming of age, and we don't believe in those things. Then a few years ago, he wrote a book which was his first book was seen to be, quote, prophetic, and turned out he wasn't prophetic. And he wrote a new book, and he called this one, he spent several years researching, he called this one Fire from Heaven. And he says, I was wrong. The cities today are more spiritual than they ever were. And what had happened was, as he looked around at the historical denominational churches in the inner cities of America, the time he wrote in the 60s, The Secular City, they were they were basically becoming empty, huge, empty buildings. And he said, what I didn't understand was the power in those storefront Pentecostal churches of what they were going to be able to do to affect it. And so, anyway, but I wanted to say this. The reason why this is going to be important when I'm talking about some of these guys is for you to know who they are. Because this is what Warfield did, and this is what John MacArthur does today. It's called ad hominem arguments. And basically what it is, rather than arguing against the teaching or the point or the teaching itself, if it seems like that you can't argue particularly from history, because you can say, well, there are these accounts of healing, then what you do is you destroy the credit of your witness. It's argument against the man, against the person. It's character assassination. Because they believe that if I can prove, if my view is that these things can't happen or they weren't supposed to happen, and if they are happening, then I must prove that the character of the witnesses can't be trusted, or we have to assume that what was happening wasn't really from God, it's from the devil, and it's counterfeit. And so as we're looking through this, you have to understand that today I'm going to look at the church history, and I will talk something about who this man was in church history so that you can understand how important. Was he gullible? Was he a person of his time? Were these accounts so ludicrous that no one could really believe them? Tomorrow I'll talk about this, but there was this guy named Conyers, and I'll talk about him tomorrow. but he wrote a treatise against basically Roman Catholicism he's in England. And John Wesley, since I'm in a Wesleyan church here, a Methodist church, Wesley, when he read this, he said, I am afraid that this book was written not just against Rome, but it could be labeled against all of Christianity. He perceived the negative impacts of it. So anyway, a lot of people don't care about church history, but I found out if you know church history, it gives you a great discernment. Understanding of the Bible and understanding of the history of the church is extremely important to have good discernment. And some of the things, like some of the critics on the radio today that says, well, this, Christ's descent into hell or his spiritual death, that's heresy. And they make charges against some of the Word of Faith teachers. The only problem is that it's in the creed. And even to say, well, if it wasn't in the creed in the earliest years, but then it was added later, that means that there was such a belief in the church at that time, and it had been held for so long, that it was accepted in one of the early creeds of the church. Now, yes, what were the creeds of the church written for? You have to understand that most people at that time couldn't read. And they didn't have a Bible of their own. And so how did you know what was true Christianity? True Christianity was to be protected through the early creeds of the church that said, this is what we all agree together throughout the whole church in the world. This is what we agreed to. Those were the creeds. The creeds were written to protect the Christians from being led into false doctrine. So, having said that, let's just take a step. Now, I'm not going to be teaching you 2,000 years of church history in 3 hours. That's a little, that'd be quite ambitious. I think it was ambitious enough to teach you 2,000 years of the history of healing within Christianity. That was ambitious enough. But in 1973, Dr. Morton Kelsey, who was an Episcopalian priest, wrote a book called Healing Christianity. And by the way, most of my notes on this is taken from that book. The reason why I did it, I wrote this while I was in Brazil, most of it while I was in Brazil, and I had that book with me. But I have read many, many, many more books, and I could have given you, 15 or 20 books. Thank you, Andre. And I could give you 15 or 20 books that had these different resources. And if I ever put this into a book form, I'm just going to go back and to the Ante-Nicene Fathers and get the quotes directly. But having said that, this is an interesting book because they did a study, and I want to pick up on page 87. And remember, this is 1973, so when it talks about in the past 30 years, that would have gone back to 1943. It says, finally, in the past 30 years or so, men in other areas of medicine have come to realize that many physical illnesses can have a psychic factor. With growing realization that man cannot be treated piecemeal, physicians have begun to treat him as a whole functioning organism, including his social and religious life. And that's much more true today than it was in 1973 when Kelsey wrote that. But the average Orthodox clergyman is not much interested in practice that would convey healing. The Orthodox, now we're not talking about the Orthodox Christianity, like Russian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox. Here we're talking about just the average true believing Christian, Presbyterian, Baptist, Lutheran, whatever, all those, that's the way it's meant here. The Orthodox Christian, whether liberal or conservative, has little exposure to such sacramental acts and little or no interest in physical or mental healing through religious means. Kelsey follows with examples where doctors and clergy were called together to discuss spiritual healing. The physicians were actively interested, but the clergy were indifferent and didn't even take the topic seriously. He then continues, what then is the real place, or is the place of healing in Christianity of the modern world? Differences over the value of sacramental or religious healing in the church is only one symptom of a fundamental division among Christians about how God acts in human life. The points of view are so diametrically opposed and so deeply divided that they are often unspoken, and each side simply accepting the validity of its own view without question. Thus, in the Christian churches today, we find two conflicting attitudes toward the ministry of the healing of Jesus of Nazareth and the apostles. A ministry that was practically unbroken for 1,000 years of the church's history, church's life. On one hand, among certain religious groups today, we find an increasing interest in this spiritual ministry of healing. On the other, we come face to face with the fact that in most Protestant churches today, there is actually hostility to the practice of religious healing, hostility even to the idea of it. Now, did you know that? The question is going to be why. Now, I'd like to pick up there a minute. 3 years ago, we did one of the first one of these that's happened in many years. I went at St. Louis University is the Dominican school. It's the oldest university west of the Mississippi River. And we were invited in by the Divinity School and the medical school. And we did something very much what Kelsey had done, and we had proposed a lecture series. It was called a Symposium, and it was going to be called Healing, Protestant, Catholic, and Medical Perspectives. The invitation was sent out by the university to all the clergy in the area, and not going to say all, but many doctors and medical people, nurses, therapists. When we gathered, there's about 600 or 700 people present. There was about 4 doctors and nurses and therapists for every clergy person that responded. There was not near as much interest. Now, and this was 60 years after the one that had been done in the Northwest that Kelsey's book references. And we found that the same case, that there was very little interest on the part of the clergy. I went to Yale a couple of years ago. Was scheduled, someone had invited me in to speak to the Divinity School, and almost none of them showed up. Some doctors came, though, and one of them I'll never forget is a woman doctor. She was so blown away, she couldn't hardly sleep all night, that the power of God was going through her body and everything. And she just couldn't believe it, and she's telling her friends about it. So I got a letter from Dr. Fred Sigworth, I believe is his name, who teaches at Yale. And he wrote me a letter, and he said, if the Divinity School is not ready for you, the medical school is. Will you come and teach? And so we're scheduled to go do a symposium. We were going to do it in a university building, but if I do it in the university, we can't video it, and I want the video. So we're going to do it at a church on the grounds of Yale University, and so we're really excited, about that. And Dr. Kendi Brown, who was a PhD from Harvard, who helped put the one on in St. Louis, is now teaching at Indiana University at North Bloomington, Indiana. And she told another doctor, and I have an email about it, which I'd like to maybe share with you on Saturday morning. But this email basically says, I was so excited when I heard Dr. Brown share about the symposium you did at St. Louis University, which has also had cooperating professors from Washington University was there. And he said, if I would like to propose for you to come to the University of Indiana. We have the second largest medical school in the United States. I would love for you to come, but here's the things you need to give me. and if you can get these things, then I will represent and try to get you to come to speak. And here's the sad thing. There is more faith amongst the doctors in America than there are as a profession. There's more openness to spiritual healing, and put it that way. There's more openness to spiritual healing amongst the medical community than there is the clergy in America today. And then you wonder, why isn't there more healing in the church in America? Now, what complicates this is our culture has done a end run around the church. While the church has been debating whether or not healing is for today, the culture has answered that question, said yes, it is. Healing is for today. Our culture has become very open, but at the same time that it's very open, it doesn't understand the difference between healing models that are based upon an understanding of the world, of human nature, and of God. They don't understand the difference between something that's consistent with Judeo-Christian beliefs and something that's based upon a worldview that the understanding of God is not the Judeo-Christian worldview of God. The understanding of humanity is not consistent with the Judeo-Christian understanding of a human being. And the relationship between the interfacing between a higher being, and I'm using that word purposely there, and matter is inconsistent. And it's extremely important because one of the problems is we have people who are being trained in our hospitals. And I'm on a little soapbox here. But I believe that the hospital systems is the Mount Carmel of our day. And if America doesn't wake up, and if we don't have these types of teachings in our medical schools and universities, there's a subtle switch, and we will be where Brazil is today. We will be there in 15 or 20 years, which is 80% of Brazilians go to spiritist healers. And the spiritist healers that they go to have very similar worldviews to the practitioners of Reiki. So let me just throw something out so I'll quit beating around the bush and come to the point. Take my gloves off a little bit. There are people who practice practices that love God but are deceived because they don't understand that Reiki is based upon the Hindu view of God and of reality. And there are people who practice that and therapeutic touch, which was developed by an RN with a PhD in Colorado. And I'm not angry. Please, she's probably an awesome person and loves people. To be concerned about healing is a noble thing, but there needs to be an understanding. Pantheism is this. For example, if you would never pray to God in pantheism because there is no personal God to pray to. There isn't one that exists. The whole thing of prayer is inconsistent with pantheism because, like Hinduism, there's this view that life is permeated and God is in everything, and that's the only place that, I can't say he or she, because it's impersonal force. It's basically the life force that's in it. And so you learn how to channel that energy that's in you. The Apostle Paul never said, I learned how to channel my energy. He said, we labor with all his energy that works so mightily within us. And so we need to be able to distinguish between these worldviews, and it needs to be taught in the medical schools, and there needs to be clarity. And that's one of the things that I'm working on. This is one of my passions right now. I told Scott about it. But anyway, I didn't have time to run that rabbit, but at least, hopefully, you have at least a little more interest in what he's about to teach. Because if you just try teaching without any context, well, why is he telling me this? Now you're going to know why I'm telling you this. Because the ad hominem arguments, which says you can't trust these guys. They were people of their time, naive. They didn't understand things. I'm going to tell you these. I'm going to be telling you the stories of some of the most brilliant, most highly educated, most understanding men who fought for the basic doctrines today that we hold as orthodoxy. For example, the doctrine of the Trinity, the doctrines of the nature of Jesus. Okay, well, anyway, we get started. Bottom page 88. We want to look at these three periods of history today. We're going to look mainly through the first 600 years, but most of today on this first lecture before basically 300 years. And then in the next period, we'll go from about 600 to 1900 AD, so we'll hit a few hundred years there. And in the last session after lunch, we're going to deal with the last 100 years, a little over that. And so in this first period of time, to help me understand, and because of my Baptist background, which I like alliteration, it helps me remember. And so just under these 4 P's, we're going to have an understanding of what was happening in the first several hundred years of Christianity. And I call it persecution, purity, Plato, and power. Now, each of those are very important to understand what was going on in relationship to healing in this first few hundred years. And there's 3 things to note about persecution. Persecution came from the Christian threat to the status quo. The church has never been persecuted when it didn't threaten the status quo. When the church is weak, when it's anemic, when the church doesn't threaten anything dealing with the government, when it doesn't threaten the worldview of the period, as long as the church can do its religious stuff privately and keep it out of the public sector where it belongs. Christianity, that's just a private religion. You can practice it all you want in your private prayer closet. But don't let it get out and bother anybody else or have an impact upon the society. Persecution produces purity. Purity produces power. Because persecution drives out of the church or prevents from ever arising in the church lukewarmness. You don't have very many nominal believers when if they find out you're Christian, they come and confiscate all your property. You have no one coming to church to develop their downline when their whole line could be destroyed by the government because you're a Christian. And now, on page 89, I want to skip that, except to say there's a person who helped me who was working on some of this one quote here. In Christianity, we've done a disservice to our Jewish brothers. We have a horrible history of a lot of things that we did that was very, very bad. And sometimes we wrote, even as John talks about the Jews, they're basically, even in John's gospel, because many of the Jews became followers. Matter of fact, all the Christians were Jews. The first Christians were all Jews. And it wasn't until the success of Paul's ministry and we began to have this issue of how can we observe kosher law and Jew and Gentile eating together that we began to have some problems. And then with the destruction of Jerusalem, and the Christians had heard what Jesus has said, and they, Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 21, and so they left the city. They had been warned, and they left the city, and so the Christian Jews didn't die with the non-Christian Jews in the destruction of Jerusalem, and that caused a little bit of a conflict. And then basically, there was persecution from the Jewish community, but it was persecution from the Sanhedrin. It wasn't persecution basically from the Jewish people. And some of the Sanhedrin believed, and some of the high priests believed and were baptized. And so when in the persecution where the Sanhedrin sent Paul out, there was, from the most highly educated religious Jews, there was persecution of Christianity. And Paul had to deal with the Judaizing party. But if you would look back to the just common Jewish people, there wasn't a rejection of Christianity or a persecution of Christianity. Now, the only problem with people who get persecuted, sometimes those who get persecuted become persecutors. And we did. And the church really did some horrible things, which I think a lot of things have been done in identification, repentance, repent for some of the things that we did, not only to the Jews, but we've done things to each other. Now, and so the first persecution did come from the Sanhedrin, and then Christianity wasn't persecuted at first because it was perceived to be legal, because it was seen to be a sect of Judaism. And it was only later when it began to be seen to be, it's so different in the sense of that it was perceived to be now, it's a new religion and it's illegal. Now, why would the Roman people, government, persecute the church? Well, they had the Nero worship, or worship of the emperor. The Jews didn't have to because they had a special relationship. Once the church wasn't perceived to be a part of that, and the fact that the church was much more evangelistic than Judaism was, Judaism basically focused on its own people. Christianity was taking the gospel that was offered first to the Jew and then to the Gentile, to all people. And the Christians were saying, there is no God except Jesus. You know, in a sense of Nero's not a God, and all these other religions were syncretistic. You could believe in what you believed and believe in what they believed too, that's the way, that's real popular. And New Age is that way. You can believe, yeah, sure, of course, believe in Jesus, just believe in these other guys too. No problem. Come on, more the merrier. But Christianity says, no, we cannot worship. And so when you can't worship, the emperor was seen to be, you were a traitor to the empire. And then there were false accusations that our love feast were, that's a nice name. You can see how easily that could be misinterpreted. Where are you going? We're going down to our love feast. Well, they thought we were pretty immoral. And they really thought we were atheists because we didn't believe in the gods. We believed in one God. And then they also, just to make things a little bit worse, he said, well, those Christians, they're cannibals. They eat the flesh and blood of their God. So there's a lot of misunderstanding. So we want to pick up and just say that, but in those first few years, though, because of these persecutions, the church was full of purity and power, and there wasn't this nominalism that would fill the church later. Now, Plato's important. He lived in 428 to 347. Plato had a philosophy, a Platonic philosophy. Later have Neoplatonism. And basically, let me explain that. The good side of it was Plato believed that there was a spirit world that was just as real as the material world. And out of this spirit world were demons and angels, and there was also information that could be transmitted to us, and we could gain information from illumination from this other world. Plato would say, this is the pulpit, this is a lectern, but this is only a shadow of the real. And in another world, there's a spirit lectern that's more real than this one. So this was good in some ways. It made the Greek, in some ways, it made the Bible, the Old Testament, with its angels and demons and a God that could speak, and that made it really easy for Platonists who had Platonist philosophy to identify and say, oh yeah, that makes sense. And it was plenty of room for connection between the worlds, the spirit world and this world. That's the positive side. The negative side of it was that the spirit world is the good world, and the material world is not so good. And it became sense that what's really important is your soul, not your body. And because of that, or your spirit, is what's important, not your body. And because of that, this body became deprecated. Some of the stuff that came into the Catholic Church actually comes out of this, like flagellating yourself, because it was perceived. This is the influence of Greek philosophy upon the Christian teaching that developed, and so it's like doing things to your body that you can grow spiritually was perceived to be good. And one of the things about that is that one of the earliest heresies called Gnosticism, which was in existence by the time 1 John is written. 1 John was written basically, one of the main things it was written about was to combat Gnosticism. If anyone says that Jesus didn't come in the flesh, the spirit of Antichrist that's part of it is this denial of the incarnation. Because the incarnation was foolishness to the Greek, because God, if there's a God, he's in the spirit realm, okay? Well, that's good, but for God to take on flesh, that is a contradiction of terms, because flesh is bad. And why would you, do that? And so it was foolishness to the Greek and a stumbling block to the Jew that God would become flesh and die at a cross. Now, so one of the problems was in Gnosticism, which it was, like I said, that one of the first Christian heresies we had to fight was this: God doesn't care whether or not you get your healed. God doesn't care about your body. He cares about your soul. Gnostic Christians had no value for healing. So when you hear somebody on the radio say that these new Word of Faith teachers and these healers they're teaching a new Jesus, well, I would just like to tell you that the Jesus that we teach is not the Gnostic Jesus who had no value for healing. You see, the Jesus that doesn't have a value for healing is a Gnostic Jesus based upon an influence of Greek philosophy. Because the Judeo-Christian heritage based upon Judaism was God made our bodies and it is good. Yeah. Not bad. Yeah. It's good. And that's why in the Christian religion and Judeo-Christian religion, it has the resurrection of the body, because the body is seen as good. Shoot that one. So anyway, now, the other thing about this Gnostic influence, though, since the body doesn't count, then you either can beat it up Or you can do anything you want with your body, and it's not going to affect your spirit because the body is bad anyway. And so if you join yourself to prostitutes, and if you get drunk, and you do all that won't affect you spiritually, because that's dealing with the body. And the body, we know what the body's about, and so let the body be for the body, but you're going to worship God of your spirit. When you have a negative view of the body, you're departing from the Judeo-Christian understanding of the purpose of the body. God made it. It's part of the creation. And creation's not bad. Creation's good. You see, in the Gnosticism, the God himself wouldn't even create the earth because it's so bad. And materialism is so bad. So there'd be different emanations of God. Finally, he gets so far away from the one he emanated from that this one now, this demiurge, he can create whatever it is. The point where I'm going with this is I've been all over the world. I've been to Cambodia and Thailand and Singapore and China and India, and the influence for medicine and hospitals is so much stronger. One of the things I'm reading now is the history between Christianity and medicine. And actually, one of my personal assistants reading this book for me and filling me in on it, because there's just so many books you can read, and this one's about that thick. So, but we're finding out that with the birth of Christianity and a God who became human, and who so loved the poor and the sick, and he had a mission to heal them. There was that religion that had a value. Well, let's do something to help them. We were in, 2 years ago, we just got back from India, but 2 years ago we were in India, and a friend of mine who was a photographer, professional photographer, he made the mistake. We walked by on the way to get to this place. There was a Dalit, which is this guy, and all long-haired, and he was just skin and bones, and the lowest of the society of the caste system, and laying in the ditch, and flies blowing him. And my friend was moved with compassion, and literally stopped and ran back to him with a bottle of water to give him a drink. And you would have thought he's about to create a riot, because he was doing what was, by the old caste system, which is supposed to be illegal today, illegal. He was touching the untouchable. He was showing compassion to a man who shouldn't be shown. Now, why? I'm just going to stop for a moment. I'm really getting behind here. Bad. You can read the notes. The difference is between a grace-based system and a karma-based system. A grace-based system says, but the grace of God could be me. And so I'm moved with compassion because my Savior, my God, identifies. You didn't do, and as much as you didn't do it to this man, you didn't do it to me, who gave in that Matthew 25 passage such respect, dignity to every human being, to the prisoners, to the poorest of the poor. Karma, on the other hand, says this: he's there because that's what he's earned. If not in this life, one of the last lives. And so if you don't get it right the first time around, you get reborn into something worse. If you did better, you did well, you come back a little better next time. And so when you're in that system, if you're at the top of society, you feel like I'm there because in my last lives I've worked my way up to this place, and that person is there because in their last lives they deserve that. There is very little mercy and no grace in that system. So I don't know why so many people want to rush to it. It was, U2. What's the guy? Bono? Bono, the U2 guy. He wrote a little article about grace rather than karma. And I agree with him. I'd rather have the grace. Well, anyway, in the next 8 minutes, the testimony of the Ante-Nicene Fathers. Ante-Nicene just means the period of time before the Creed of Nicaea, which is 325 A.D. And these Ante-Nicene Fathers, they made all types of reports and records of people being healed. Justin Martyr, who was martyred for his faith, 165 A.D., he talks about all the healings that he had seen, all the powers that had happened. You can read it for numberless demoniacs throughout the whole world and in your city. Many of our Jewish Christian men exercising them in the name of Jesus Christ have healed and do heal, rendering the helpless and driving the possessing devils out of the men, though they could not be cured by all of the other exorcists and those who use incantation and drugs. He saw just all types of healings. Hermas, who died around 150 A.D., I like this part, and just quote, he, therefore, that knows the calamity of such a man and does not free him from it, commits a great sin and is guilty of his blood. Hermas said, hey, average Christian, you see somebody sick and you don't stop to help them and pray for them, you're committing a sin. That's what he thought. The people believe that both bodily and mental illness was caused by some domination of an evil entity. And the fact that you could have power over that proved that the Spirit of God was operating in that healer. Tertullian was one of the greatest church theologians of his day. Some people believe, and I concur, that he was the greatest theologian the first 1,000 years except for Augustine. He was one of the great minds of his day. And he later, however, joined the Montanist movement, which again proves to me that it wasn't near as bad as what we read about from the eyes of the critics. He had seen a lot of healings, and you can read on page 91. I'm just going to read the last part. Elsewhere, he also says that God could and sometimes did recall men's souls to their bodies. In these notes, you'll find quite a few raisings of the dead. Not near as many people, though, as being raised now. See, you need to know that, in my opinion, we today are living in a greater, more, we're living in a time where the message of the gospel is accomplishing more miracles and more healings than any other period of time. Even in the first few hundred years. Now, what I mean by that is the church has had a chance to grow. It's a lot more of us. We're all over the world now. We're recapturing the message of the kingdom. And as we recapture the message of the kingdom, when we begin to realize these things are still possible, it's going to really start exploding in the years to come. And when Bill's students and our students from GSSM and Bethel School of Supernatural Ministry are taking off, I tell you, it is exciting what we're seeing happen. I'm going to skip down to page 92, the bottom page. You can read these other guys. This is all just different people and church history and some of the stuff that they've done and seen. But Irenaeus was this amazing guy, and he lived in France, which was Gaul at that time, now France. But he saw so much happening. He actually was farther away from Rome too, which meant the likelihood of him being persecuted, it was a little harder for them to get to him than it was if you'd, living right in Rome itself. And so he had these amazing things that he had seen. He wrote a book on Against Heresies, and one of its telling points was that heretics were not able to accomplish the miracles of healing that Christians could perform. Irenaeus attested to miracles of healing that Christians tested almost the same range of healings as we found in the Gospels of Acts. Now, that 2 sentences ago was really important, because with Irenaeus, you have within Christianity the beginning of connecting miracles to accreditation or certification or vindication, or the miracles themselves were beginning to serve as evidential that the Christians are right in what they believe. Now, and that's, in some ways, that becomes very detrimental. But I just wanted to point it out to you. That's where he said that. All kinds of bodily infirmity as well as many different diseases had been cured. The damage from external accidents had been repaired. He had seen the exorcism of all sorts of demons. There is no indication that Irenaeus viewed any disease as incurable or any healing as against God's will. Indeed, the whole attitude he voiced was that healing is a natural activity of Christians as they express the creative power of God given them as members of Christ. In one place, Irenaeus speaks of the prayer and fasting of an entire church as effective in raising a person from the dead. Now, I'm going to skip the next two guys there because you can read that because I'm having to be selective here. I want to talk about the testimony of the doctors of the church. Now, what does doctors of the church mean? It doesn't mean they had MDs and they were going around setting people's arms. This was a title given to what the church believed to be their greatest teachers that helped establish orthodoxy. It's a very honorable title given to only a handful of people. These were the most brilliant and strongest leaders of the early church. Most were born a few years before or sometime after the Edict of Milan in 313, which is what legalized Christianity. Constantine did that. And it gave it as, all right, only a few years later, Christianity would become the official religion of the Roman Empire. There would be many heresies to face, and the church would be wrestling with its faith. But we shall see that healing continued to be a very important part of the faith. Now, in the doctors from the East, when I'm talking about East and West, East would become Eastern Orthodoxy, Russian Orthodoxy, Greek Orthodoxy, the Orthodox. Now, the Orthodox held, I believe, if I can remember correctly now, to the first creeds, the first three general councils of the church were authoritative, and the Roman church allowed more councils of the church, like up to Vatican II, Second Vatican Council. So for when I talk about East and West, we're talking mainly Constantinople, Turkey, over in that area, and the West would be more like Rome and Europe versus, and it was all one church for the first 1,054 years, and then they had the divide in 1054. So, in the on the eastern side, you have Athanasius was the main defender of the Trinity, and Trinitarian understand the Christian faith. The other three men were the great Cappadocians, Basil the Great, his brother Gregory of Nyssa, and their friend Gregory of Nazianzus. And the life and power of Gregory Thaumaturgus, he was called the Wonder Worker. This guy was so amazing that that's the title he got in the early church, the Wonder worker, and his miracles were extremely powerful. And he came to the Cappadocians in the days of the persecution, and he strongly influenced these three families. Now, these three families are important because they're going to develop so much of the best doctrine within Christianity. The greatest preacher of the time, John Chrysostom, who is known as the Golden Tongued because of his eloquence, golden mouth. Now, Athanasius, he's the one that helped fight for the Trinity. If it hadn't have been for Athanasius, Christianity, and of course, that's ridiculous to say that it hadn't been for Athanasius. Let's say God was sovereignly working through Athanasius and used him to fight for it. And if they'd killed Athanasius, God would have raised up somebody else to fight for the doctrine of the Trinity. But so the reason why I want to point that out was this. When you say these guys are the men of the time, they're silly, they're incredulous, they're gullible, they had such a warped mentality, or you can't trust them, in order so that you can destroy their testimonies of healings. What are you doing for these are the very men, our brightest and best, who fought to preserve orthodoxy? It's a very dangerous slope to be on.